Have you heard of CO2 capture and sequestration? Will they work? Will they allow cap and trade to cut CO2 emissions? Here is the agenda driving cap and trade legislation. There is a concerted effort to have the United States cut its CO2 emissions 80%. But what would it mean to cut CO2 emissions by 80%? This chart shows we would have to cut our CO2 emissions to the same level as during World War I, when Woodrow Wilson was president. And we must do this while our population is increasing 139 million people by 2050. And what is the source of our CO2 emissions? 39% comes from generating electricity. 20% comes from driving our cars using gasoline. In other words, nearly 2/3 of our CO2 emissions come from these two sources. Coal-fired power plants produce 82% of the CO2 emissions caused by generating electricity. Essentially, we must stop using coal or find ways to capture and sequester the CO2 emissions caused by using coal. Can we replace coal with some other method of generating electricity? Possibilities include nuclear power and renewables. But if we can't replace coal, can we capture the CO2 emissions from coal-fired power plants, and can we sequester CO2 in geologic formations? Nuclear could replace coal. However, there is fierce opposition to building new nuclear power plants. Renewables, such as wind, solar, geothermal, and hydrokinetics, are too small in scale to generate enough electricity to replace coal. Can we capture CO2 from new coal-fired power plants? New IGCC coal-fired power plants can capture CO2 if they are built with the necessary equipment. 2 IGCC plants have been built in the U.S., but neither was built with the ability to capture CO2. But capturing CO2 is useless if it can't be stored underground using sequestration. And can we capture CO2 from roughly 500 existing coal-fired power plants? Experimental processes are being tested for capturing CO2 from existing coal-fired power plants. These experimental processes may not be commercially available until 2020, if ever. In addition, so much power is drained away by the equipment added to the existing power plants for capturing CO2 that they must be derated 20 to 40%. In other words, 1 new power plant must be built every time 3 existing power plants are retrofitted to capture CO2. And this brings us to sequestration. There are a few small examples of where sequestration has been used, but the process hasn't been proven for the massive amounts of CO2 that must be sequestered. First, the geologic formations must be identified that can hold the CO2 without leaking, either leaking CO2 back into the atmosphere or into adjoining geologic formations where it can cause harm. Thousands of miles of pipeline must also be built to transport the liquid CO2. There also are many legal issues that must be addressed. Who owns the geologic formations? And who will be liable if the CO2 leaks from the geologic formation or from pipelines? The government has produced an atlas of geologic formations that might hold CO2. Platts has produced a map showing the location of over 400 U.S. coal-fired power plants rated 100 megawatt and above. Using Platts' map together with his atlas geologic formations, we have superimposed the pipelines needed to connect these coal-fired power plants with the nearest geologic formation for sequestering CO2. Over 11,000 miles of pipeline are needed to transport liquefied CO2 from these large coal-powered plants, and this doesn't include the smaller coal-fired power plants. There is still the question of cutting gasoline usage by 80%. There are no viable substitutes for gasoline. Biofuels are inadequate. Natural gas only cuts emissions by 30%. and plug-in electric vehicles, when they become available, will only cut CO2 emissions by 18%. It would appear that rationing will be inevitable. We can conclude from the foregoing that we lack proven technologies for cutting CO2 emissions to 80%. The Congressional Budget Office estimates cap and trade could cost $300 billion every year. There is no real economic benefit from companies having to purchase carbon permits. Permits are a creature of the government that create artificial scarcity and have no real underlying value. There will be a hidden tax increase as the cost for electricity, gasoline, and all the products that use electricity and gasoline for their production are passed along to the consumer. The price of electricity will go up. The price of paper products will go up. The price of food will go up. And carbon permits traded on a world market valued at trillions of dollars can become toxic assets, just like subprime mortgages. They can crash to zero when everybody realizes it's impossible to cut CO2 emissions by 80%. The impact on the economy from cap and trade regulations will be enormous. Without new coal-fired or nuclear power plants, there won't be enough electricity to light our homes and power our industry. There will be a loss of jobs, along with blackouts. The book Carbon Folly contains more information about these technologies. Go to www.carbonfolly.com for more information. Any politician who says cap and trade can cut CO2 emissions 80% without crippling our economy and taking away our freedom is insincere or uninformed. We hope you have found this information useful. Please look at our other videos, such as on cap and trade and biofuels, that provide more detailed information on several issues, by typing in the words energy clarity on YouTube. This presentation has been produced by T.S. August. Additional information is available at www.tsaugust.org. Thank you for listening.